And we're continuing with the 10th chapter of Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine L'Engle. This chapter is called The Body in the Hearse. On the promenade deck of the Orion, the passengers sat in a stiff circle. Geraldo had brought out a coffee tray and had been asked by the Dutch consul to serve cognac and liqueurs and to make lemonade for Polly and Charles. Miss Leonis, too, chose lemonade. "Where is that little policeman who met me?" She disposed of Gutierrez, but she disposed of Gutierrez by her tone of voice. "Gutierrez, I have taken over the case," Hurtado said calmly. "I'm so glad," Mrs. Smith clasped her small hands together. "He was trying to question us in such a bullying way," Dr. Wordsworth said. "He appeared to be the kind of small-town policeman who immediately gets puffed up with the enormity of his own insignificance." "Murders and missing persons are hardly in his line," Vermeer beamed. "A little smuggling here and there is more the kind of problem he comes up against. More cognac, my dear madam." He gazed admiringly at Dr. Wordsworth's dark good looks. "Thank you, no." She gave him a bright smile. Deftly, Hurtado led the conversation in what seemed a casual way, ably seconded by Vermeer. In a short time, they had found out a good deal about the passengers. Hurtado began questioning Dr. Eisenstein about the Quistano Indians. "It is interesting, is it not, that you should be planning to visit these people who seem in some way connected with the stolen portrait?" "And therefore possible," Vermeer said jovially, "with the murder." "I cannot understand it," Dr. Eisenstein exclaimed. "Why would the Quistano name be written on the back of Mr. Fair's portrait?" She turned to Miss Leonis. "He bought the portrait from you, I believe." "Yes," Miss Leonis said, "but I'm afraid I can tell you nothing." "My dear madam," Vermeer pursued, "nothing?" "Nothing. I have undertaken this journey because I, too, need information." Hurtado noted the determined set of the old woman's jaw, the bone showing clearly beneath the soft, finely wrinkled skin. Dr. Eisenstein continued. "And why didn't Jan tell me he's part Quistano, when he knows that the entire purpose of this trip for me is to visit the settlement on Dragon Lake?" "You did not ask him," suggested Vermeer. "But who could guess? He looks completely Dutch." True, Vermeer agreed amiably. "But on a happier occasion, you and I must chat, my dear doctor. I, too, am interested in the local Indians, and have found Jan most helpful. Perhaps later on I can be of service to you." "Oh, thank you," Dr. Eisenstein said. "There are so many things I would have liked to ask Jan." "It would have been so interesting for all of us," Mrs. Smith said. "When we lived in—" She stopped herself in horror, putting her pudgy hand in her mouth. Vermeer asked with sociable interest. "When you lived where, Mrs. Smith?" "Vermont. Burlington, Vermont," Hurtado said. "Your Spanish is excellent, Mrs. Smith. Both yours and your husband's. I congratulate you." "Thank you," Mrs. Smith began to knit rapidly. "Did you learn your Spanish in Vermont?" Mr. Smith took off his spectacles and began to polish them. "We frequently visit our granddaughter and her family in Costa Rica. "You've never been to Venezuela before?" Hurtado asked. "Certainly we have been to Venezuela," Mr. Smith put on his spectacles. "When we come to South America, we always spend a little time visiting and sightseeing in places other than Costa Rica, which is where we learned to speak Spanish, although our grandson-in-law speaks excellent English." "Your grandson-in-law is Costa Rican?" "Yes." "And yet your accent is that of Caracas," Hurtado said. Mrs. Smith burst into tears. Vermeer sprang to his feet and held a large white linen handkerchief out to her. "My dear madam, please do not upset yourself so. What has happened?" He patted her clumsily on the shoulder. "I can't bear it," Mrs. Smith sobbed. "I can't bear being terrified of being found out like this." "Patty!" Mr. Smith tried to stop her. "My dear madam," Vermeer said. "Found out about what? You have nothing to fear as long as you speak the truth." Hurtado held up a hand to stop Vermeer. He spoke. in his quiet, unempathetic way to the weeping woman. "Would you like to speak to me alone?" She shook her head. Her soft face was streaming with tears. "I'd like everybody to hear. It's better that way." "Patty, please." But she could not stop. Why doesn't Hurtado take her away? Polly wondered, and then answered her own question. She might not talk unless she does it right now, right here, but it's horrible. Charles reached out and took his sister's hand and held it tightly. Miss Leonis had thought that she was beyond embarrassment, but she was not. She looked at Mr. Theo, who was scowling ferociously at Hurtado. "He's an honorable man, my Odell." The words flowed from Mrs. Smith like her tears. "A fine man. No one finer, but when we were young he had a problem, a gambling problem." Mr. Smith stood up, knocking over his chair, and moved away from them. Vermeer moved swiftly toward him, but Mr. Smith only went to the rail and looked out at sea. Vermeer said, "My good man, if this has nothing to do with the murder, it will quickly be forgotten by us all." Mrs. Smith dabbed her eyes. "He worked in a bank in Caracas. He had a fine position for a young man. We were doing well. I was teaching English, and he had a lovely little house, and we had a lovely little house in Macuto. It's a suburb, a nice one. Then he lost a lot of money, and he borrowed from the bank." "Borrowed?" Hurtado asked. He told me what he had done. I made him go immediately to the president of the bank and pay it back. Odell did, with interest. He worked hard, and he paid back every penny. He wasn't asked to leave his job. The president of the bank was like a father to us, and everything was all right. And ever since that one time, there's been nothing. He's never gambled again, ever. And he was vice president of the bank in Burlington. They gave him an engraved silver tray when he retired. It was all behind us." Dr. Eisenstein, who was sitting near Mrs. Smith, tried to stop her. "Dear Mrs. Smith, why are you telling us all this? There's no need." "But there is. We had forgotten it in the past, but then there was that night at bridge. You can't have forgotten that night." "No. Maybe he suspected." "Who suspected?" Hurtado asked. "Mr. Fair. Maybe he suspected about Odell and was testing. I don't know how he found out. How will he find out?" "People like Mr. Forsyth Fair had a way of finding things out," Dr. Wordsworth said. I was given a sharp nudge by Dr. Eisenstein. "However, he found out. He found out and went to Odell." "Mr. Fair went to your husband?" Hurtado prompted. "Yes, he went to Odell." Mr. Smith turned from the rail and moved back into the light. "He threatened me. He said if I didn't pay him, he would tell everybody what had happened, and he would spread the story in Costa Rica, and it would hurt our granddaughter." He stopped, then he said very quietly, "I told him that as far as I was concerned, he could jump overboard. I do not want the past reopened. I do not want our granddaughter to think less of me. I do not want anybody hurt. But I will not live under the constant threat of blackmail. I knew that if I were to give him money, the demands would never stop. So I had a motive for murdering him, but I did not." "Of course you didn't," his wife cried. "You couldn't have." Of course, Vermeer said, full of cordiality. "Do have a drink, Mr. Smith. We all wish you well." Hurtado looked at his watch. "This will be all for tonight. I am grateful to you, madam." He bowed. "If you will all be equally forthright, we will sift this matter through in no time. Miss Fair, it would be my pleasure to escort you to your hotel." She nodded acquiescence. "I will see the rest of you after breakfast, out here or in the salon, whichever is cooler." "Signor Commandant," Dr. Wordsworth said, "may I suggest that the murder and the theft may not have been committed by one of the passengers?" "My dear lady, I am quite aware of that. I shall be questioning the officers and crew after you have retired." He spoke affably enough, but there was an admonition behind his words. "Vermeer, come with me, please. I will return you to your small appliance, which will surely not seat three of us." Miss Leonis moved numbly between the two men, who helped her down the gangplank. Hurtado seated her carefully in the limousine, saying, "The hotel, alas, is not air-conditioned, but I think you will find it reasonably cool." "Thank you. The heat does not bother me. My only concern is Simon." "He is my concern too, madam. I will pick you up after breakfast, say 10 o'clock. That will give you an opportunity for a good rest." "I'm much obliged. I realize that what happened on deck tonight was probably a good thing, but Do you have any idea as to the whereabouts of my nephew into the English canon? Believe me, Miss Farr, I am as anxious to find them as you are. Tom Tallis is an old friend, and a highly competent man. If Simon is with him, he is in good hands. Do you think they are together? At this moment, I see no reason to doubt it, Vermeer said. We will try to find the supposed chauffeur who met Tallis. It should not be too difficult, Miss Leonis asked. You think that someone impersonated the official chauffeur and then kidnapped Simon and Canon Tallis? Hurtado said. It is as plausible a theory as we have right now. My chauffeur thinks that his flat tire was not accidental. And the wool was pulled over Gutierrez's eyes. So it appears. Forgive me, Senor Commandant, I do not believe in teaching professionals their own business, but if you're not telling me all that you are thinking, I quite understand. But I don't think that Gutierrez is a fool, although I agree with Dr. Wordsworth that he has a somewhat enlarged estimation of his own importance. Quite, Hurtado said. And I do not trust him. Why not, Miss Fair? Sense of smell, a long life has sharpened mine. I will bear that in mind, but please try to let us do the worrying, Miss Fair. I shall not be going to bed tonight, but you must rest. Yes, she said. I know that, Senor Commandant. I wish to go to Dragon Lake tomorrow. He looked at her, his eyes a fraction of a second betraying astonishment. Madam, it is a difficult trip. Will you make arrangements for me, please? Vermeer began to protest, but Miss Leonis cut him off. Since I am not under suspicion for murder, theft, or kidnapping, there is no reason you should not allow me to go. If you would care to accompany me, Mr. Vermeer, that would be my pleasure. Hurtado looked at Vermeer with a slight nod. It shall be arranged, madam, but you will be kind enough to tell us why you wish to make this excursion. There is, after all, a Cristano name on the back of the portrait, which once belonged to me, and I have a feeling that it may help us find Simon and your friend. The limousine drew up before the broad patio of the hotel. Hurtado and Vermeer escorted her into the lobby. The chauffeur carried Miss Leonis' suitcase to the desk. My dear madam, Vermeer beamed, the Commandant and I have not eaten. Would you care to join us for a small collation? Thank you, no. The ship's dinner was more than adequate. I should like to be shown directly to my room, Hurtado said. Of course, but there is one question I would beg you to answer first. What is written on the back of your portrait of Bolivar? She answered. It once had painted on it, For my son, born of Umara. Time or effort or both have blurred and faded the writing, so that now the only letters that show clearly are U-M-A-R. What does this mean, Umar or Umara? Umara is always the inherited name of the princess of the Cristanos. How do you know this? It was written in Quentin Fair's journal and referred to his letters to his mother and to his wife, Ninny Ann. You have those letters? Hurtado asked. I do, with you. Yes, in his will, Quentin Fair requested that they not be read for 6 generations. It had always been my intention to leave them for Simon, but during the days since Simon and Forsyth boarded the Orion, I have dishonored Quentin's request and read the letters and journals. It is because of this, as you can see, that I wish to go visit the Cristanos tomorrow. Hurtado said, I assume that you felt you could give Dr. Eisenstein no information because you did not wish to confide to the assembled company. I would have had no right to make such a confidence. Hurtado's voice was quiet and courteous. But you will tell us what is in the letters and journals? I will tell you, perhaps, after tomorrow. We may have to ask you for the letters and journals. I understand, but I am not yet ready to give them to you. They are extremely personal. Madam, a policeman is completely impersonal. I am not a policeman, but I will not withhold from you anything which might help you in your inquiries. She poked at her reticule and drew out a small bundle of documents. These are the papers which Forsyth Fair gave me to establish himself as a member of the branch of the family which moved north and then west after the war between the states. I would appreciate it if you would check on them for me. Hurtado held out his hand. Certainly, Vermeer asked. Do you have any reason to doubt the authenticity of these documents? Yes. Hurtado raised his eyebrows. The check Mr. Forsyth Fair gave me for the Bolivar portrait, money which was to see me through the rest of my days, was a piece of paper, no more. Since it was for a large sum of money, it was investigated by the bank. The check is worthless. If the man were not dead, I would suspect him of absconding with my nephew, and I would place a rather large bet that he is somehow behind Simon's disappearance. There's no doubt that Forsyth Fair, whoever he was murdered, is there? No doubt at all. Now I wish to retire, Miss Leonis said. You will of course phone me at any time during the night if there is news of Simon. Of course, Miss Fair. Mynheer Vermeer will call for you after breakfast. You are fortunate in your choice of escort. Vermeer is somewhat of an anthropologist and knows Dragon Lake and its Indians as deeply as anyone who is not a native of this area. The Quistanos do not welcome strangers to their village, but Vermeer is known to them as a friend. Thank you, she bowed gravely. That is the first piece of good news I have had in a long time. I trust you will rest well, Hurtado called the night clerk and asked him to see Miss Fair to her room. I demand, madame. Vermeer bent over her hand. Good night, gentlemen. They watched after her. Her walk was stiff with fatigue, but her body was erect. In his pajamas, Charles went to Yan's cabin. The steward looked troubled. It is not good for you to be too much with me. Am I bothering you? I'm sorry. No, it is not that. I know that I am under suspicion. That's nonsense. Yan ran strong, blunt fingers through his fair hair. I did not murder him, but it is true that I am the only one to have a special interest in the portrait. Mynheer Boone says he never saw the keys, and this I do not understand, because he gave them to me in return to Mr. Fair. I don't understand either, Charles said. I know only that I am suspected. Who suspects you? Hurtado. He is the one who is important. I am not worried about Gutierrez. I know his type. While he was questioning us in the salon, he pocketed half the cigars. He's worse than the customs men, and blew and blustered at us, but he did not know what he was doing. But Hurtado is different. I hate it, Charles cried with vehemence, more like his sister than himself. I know you didn't kill Cousin Forsyth, but I can't bear to think that anybody on the Orion could have done it. Nor I, Yan said. It is a bad business. I do not know how it will end. As Charles crossed the foyer to go to his cabin, El Señor Commandant Hurtado came briskly up the stairs. Young man, I must talk to you. I must talk with you. Charles waited. Shall we go to your cabin? In the cabin, Charles looked at the bunk in which Simon had spent only one night. He asked, Where are Simon and Canon Tallis? Hurtado lowered himself onto the chair and regarded Charles with his steel gaze. I wish that I could tell you, Charles, but they are not off my mind for one moment. Tom Tallis is my friend. He touched his breast pocket and indicated a small two-way radio. If there is any news, we will know at once. Now, Charles, I want you to tell me about your dreams. How do you know about my dreams? You seem to have discussed them with a good many people. Slowly, Charles crossed his legs. Dreams are dreams. They aren't evidence. They don't hold up in court. We're not in court. Anything may be important. A reaction to a dream may give us the clue that I need. It may help me to find Simon and Tallis as well as the murderer. Charles closed his eyes. All right, I'll tell you. If Canon Tallis phoned you from London to make sure that you would know he was coming, that tells me two things, and they are that you are his friend and therefore to be trusted, and also he must have suspected something might happen. He takes my dreams seriously, by the way. I take most things seriously, Hurtado said. When Charles finished talking, his voice was emphatic as Hurtado's. The commandant said, I would like you to tell this to Miss Fair. Charles nodded. If she were not old and exhausted from travel and worry, I would take you to the hotel tonight, but that will not do. I will pick you up first thing tomorrow morning. You're going to take me to her rather than bringing her to the Orion? You are an intelligent boy. Yes, I have reasons. Get to bed now. Perhaps you will dream. Perhaps I will, Charles said. He did not sound happy. Simon and Canon Tallis lay on the rough ground of their clearing. They had tried to soften it with leaves and grasses, but it was still hard and uncomfortable. Their fire burned brightly, but they were grateful not so much for the warmth as for the light. Around them, the jungle was alive with noise. Some of the noises Simon recognized from South Carolina, but there were new and strange noises. which he had never heard before. Breathings and cluckings and hoots. Once he sat upright in terror as the firelight was reflected in two large amber eyes. Canon Tallis put another piece of wood on the fire. We have just enough till morning, then we'll have to collect more. What was that? Simon asked. Some jungle creature. I don't think that we'll be disturbed as long as we stay right here and keep the fire going. We'll take turns sleeping. You try to sleep now, and when I get too sleepy to be alert, I'll waken you. I don't think I'm sleepy, Simon said. No, but close your eyes and perhaps sleep will come. Do you have any idea who took the portrait? And who killed Cousin Forsyth? And why Gutierrez kidnapped us? It appears to me they're all connected, the canon said. Do you think that my ancestor, Quentin Fair, do you think he really did go to Dragon Lake and fall in love with the Umara and then leave her? It seems likely. I wish it didn't. All human beings break promises, Simon. Not Quentin Fair. The Quentin Fair of your dreams wasn't a real person. No, but I was brought up to believe that a gentleman does not break promises. That's not a bad way to be brought up. It's good to take promises seriously. Then we're not apt to make or break them lightly. I would guess your ancestor did not make his promise lightly, but that when he got away from Venezuela and Dragon Lake, it was almost as though he were waking from a dream. Dragon Lake may well have seemed more like a figment of his imagination than anything else. Once he reached cold and reasonable England, and then when he came to the North American New World and met Ninian, the dream must have seemed even further away. I do not say that this excuses him, but perhaps it does explain him. I guess so. I mean, he didn't break the promise in cold blood. It was what Aunt Leonis would call a sin of omission rather than commission. Quite. From somewhere in the jungle came the scream of a small animal, a series of hooting calls, a cry that sounded like shrill laughter. Not much like Piccadilly, the canon murmured. Do try to close your eyes and rest for a while. No use both of us staying awake all night. We'll do better at solving the mystery and getting ourselves out of this predicament if we get some rest. Simon closed his eyes. He had expected that the canon would lead them in prayer, rolling out pompous words as Dr. Kurds had been wont to do. But if the canon did any praying, it was in silence. Simon suspected that he had prayed before the boy lay down, but he could not be sure. But Canon Tallis, he understood, prayed the way Aunt Leonis prayed, and this kind of praying was something that he respected even if he did not understand it. He tried to listen to the fire rather than the noises outside their small clearing. After a while, he slid into a doze. While the boy slept, Canon Tallis took a sharp stone and slowly and carefully sharpened the end of a strong branch into a rudimentary spear. And that is the end of chapter 10.